Have you ever been with someone that you genuinely desired, that you found attractive, that you really cared about? Someone you wanted to connect with deeply, yet somehow sex didn't feel the way that you thought it should. Maybe it was more difficult for you to stay present, or you couldn't get or stay aroused. Maybe you couldn't finish. Or possibly everything was technically working, but it felt muted, like part of you wasn't fully there. What makes this experience so confusing is that you still love your partner and you find them attractive and you want the connection. So then naturally the question becomes, what is happening to me? This video is brought to you by my HarperCollins published book, Mind Over Explicit Matter. If you're ready to quit porn and reclaim your life mentally and physically, go over to drtrishleigh.com/book. Most men assume that pornography changes what they want sexually, but that's not usually all that happens. What pornography changes is what the brain learns to respond to. And once that process begins, real intimacy can find itself competing against a level of stimulation it was never designed to compete against. So to understand why, we need to talk about the molecule dopamine. Most people think dopamine is pleasure, but that isn't actually all that dopamine encapsulates. Dopamine is actually about anticipation, pursuit. It's the feeling of wanting what's coming next. Think about being a kid on Christmas Eve. The excitement wasn't opening the presents. The excitement was imagining what was inside of them. Or think about waiting for a text message from someone you really like. Sometimes the anticipation is even more powerful than the message itself. That, my friend, is dopamine. Your brain evolved to reward effort, exploration, achievement, and connection. But modern technology discovered how to activate the dopamine system without requiring effort. It goes something like this: scroll, swipe, click, repeat. And pornography may be one of the most powerful examples because unlike real intimacy, it offers endless novelty, endless intensity, variety, endless anticipation on demand. Over time, the brain begins learning that stimulation is easier to access than real connection, and that is where the problem begins. And this right here is the part that almost nobody talks about because it doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. You still want sex. You still love your partner and you crave intimacy. But something starts to feel different. You need more stimulation than you used to. Fantasy begins showing up during intimacy. Your attention drifts. Orgasm takes longer. Arousal becomes less reliable. Eventually, a thought appears that can be incredibly frightening. What is wrong with me? Most men assume it's low testosterone or stress, aging, or a relationship problem. And certainly those factors can absolutely play a role, but often there is another explanation. The reward system has adapted. And when the reward system adapts to high levels of stimulation, real-world experiences can start feeling different. They can't compete, even when nothing is wrong with the relationship itself. I worked with a client who demonstrates this idea perfectly. He was successful, married, professionally accomplished, and by most measures, living a completely normal life. There was no dramatic rock bottom moment, no obvious crisis. At first, pornography felt exciting. Then it became familiar. Then familiar became boring. That's when his brain started looking for more. Not because he's a bad person or that he lacked values, simply because the reward system was adapting. Eventually, he found himself sitting at work, scrolling escort websites. Not because he intended to hire anyone, yet. Not because he wanted to cheat on his wife. He wasn't actually looking for sex. He was looking for higher level stimulation. His brain had slowly shifted from pursuing connection to pursuing intensity. And when he realized that, it absolutely terrified him because he understood that if his brain could change this much without him ever noticing, where would it go next if he didn't interrupt that process? Pornography isn't simply something you watch. It's something your brain practices. Every repetition teaches the reward system what to prioritize. Over time, the brain can move into what I call desire miswire. Natural rewards lose some of their impact, sometimes all of their impact. Artificial rewards gain more influence. Connection becomes quieter. Novelty becomes louder. Presence becomes more difficult. Intensity becomes expected. And what makes this process particularly dangerous is that most people don't notice it happening while it's happening. They notice later in the rear view mirror. They notice it when intimacy changes and when their motivation drops, or when real life starts feeling less engaging than stimulation on a screen. That's fake, it's artificial, it's fantasy. By the time they recognize the pattern, the brain has already been practicing it for years. The science behind this is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Brain imaging research has shown that frequent pornography consumption is associated with changes in how the reward circuitry responds to sexual cues. Scientists often refer to this process as desensitization. I tend to think of it as adaptation. The brain becomes accustomed to very high levels of stimulation and begins requiring more stimulation to generate the same response. The brain isn't broken. In fact, it's doing exactly what brains are supposed to do. It is adapting to repeated experience. The problem is that adaptation doesn't stay confined to a screen. It follows you into your relationships. It follows you into intimacy. And it follows you into desire itself. What makes this even more complicated is what happens after intimacy starts feeling different. Most men become highly anxious. They begin monitoring themselves. They start paying attention to whether they're aroused enough, whether they're staying aroused, whether they're going to perform well enough. Instead of experiencing intimacy, you start evaluating it. This is where I often see what I call strained brain. It's a brain pattern. High beta brainwave activity increases, stress increases, hypervigilance goes up, and self-monitoring takes over. At the same time, the alpha brainwave that's associated with relaxation and presence and enjoyment, it often decreases. Intimacy stops feeling like an experience and it starts feeling like a test. And when that happens, the harder someone tries to perform, the more difficult the performance becomes. This is the trap very few people understand. You thought you were feeding desire, but your brain was actually being trained. You thought you were strengthening arousal, but you were strengthening stimulation-seeking behavior. You thought you were satisfying a drive, but in fact you were teaching the brain to expect intensity. Eventually, intensity becomes the requirement rather than the bonus. And that's why so many people find themselves trapped in a cycle they never intended to create. Okay, but now for the good news, of course. If your brain changed in one direction, it in fact can change in the other direction. Neuroplasticity works in both ways. The same brain that learned unhealthy patterns can in fact learn healthier ones. As overstimulation decreases, sensitivity can recover, attention can stabilize, anxiety decrease, desire can reconnect to real-world intimacy. This is what rewiring actually means. It isn't deprivation or punishment, and it's not forcing yourself to suffer. It's teaching your brain how to experience reward again through your real life, rather than constantly chasing escalating levels of stimulation. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is treating only the behavior. People focus entirely on stopping. Stop watching, stop looking, try harder, use more discipline. But behavior is often the symptom. The brain and those patterns inside, they're the source. And if the reward system has adapted deeply enough, willpower alone may not be enough to reverse it. That's why in our work, I don't guess. We measure. I use a brain map assessment with top-tier technology to understand exactly how your brain is functioning. Then I program personalized neuromodulation technology protocols that address the very pattern and retrain it so your brain works better and your body and mind work better too. Lasting change happens when we address the wiring that is creating the behaviors, not just the behavior itself. Okay, but let's dive into today's brain hack strategy. It's very simple. For the next 7 days, every time you feel the urge to reach for stimulation, pause and ask yourself this one question. Am I seeking connection or am I seeking intensity? Most people have never asked themselves that question. If the answer is connection, reach for a real person. Have a conversation, send a text, create a genuine moment of human engagement, eye contact. If the answer is intensity, put the phone down and go do something different. Play one song you genuinely love, crank it up, dance around. No scrolling, no distractions, just become present in your real life, something that gives you that stimulation. Because your brain heals when it learns how to experience reward without constantly escalating stimulation, especially in the screen. Ultimately, the goal isn't to spend your life fighting urges. The goal is to become hardwired for your life. Hardwired means healthy pathways become automatic again. Connection feels rewarding with people in the real world. Presence feels natural. And desire, it reconnects to real world intimacy again with a honey. The client I told you about earlier, well, eventually he recovered. Not because he became stronger or because he exercised more discipline. In fact, it was because his brain became different. It was improved. And that is what gives me so much hope for people struggling with this issue. I've watched it happen so many times that it's easy once you understand that the brain can change, it can recover, it can rewire itself. When it's pushed in the right direction, it can become hardwired again. So if intimacy doesn't feel the way it used to, if desire feels different or it's leading you in the wrong direction and you've been wondering whether something inside you or your brain changed, stop asking that question and start asking what your brain learned. Because recovery isn't about fighting harder. It's about training smarter. It's about understanding those brain patterns that got you here where you are today. And in fact, creating new ones that can take you to somewhere better, to the life that you want and you deserve. That's what a hardwired life is. So always remember that you must control your brain, or in fact, it will control you. I'll see you next time.